Right, in terms of tonight, obviously great pleasure to welcome Harry Woodward and Julia, who's going to take some photographs. Very briefly, Harry's going to talk on books and printing, of course, which is there. Harry first bought and sold a book when he was 15, made a profit of £20, which is not bad. I think it's fair to say that both his and Julia's business has mushroomed since then, and it's worldwide. And the type of books that they deal with, I think it's quite an eclectic mix, and it ranges from sort of early 15th century material through to Harry Potter and James Bond. Harry did a couple of degrees, astrophysics and quantum mechanics, and then just to complete the collection, Julia has a degree in business management. So they're a bright couple. And then in terms of what Harry does in his spare time, there might be some ideas here for you if you're struggling to think what you do in his spare time, because Harry plays musical instruments and he also writes and reads about philosophy, theology and science. So if you are at a loose end, there's some ideas for you. Anyway, enough of me. Can I ask you to give Harry and Julia a very warm welcome? Thanks.
Right, well, thank you. I mean, we'll see if the applause is deserved at the end. And so, though this is the history of books and printing, I'm going to start with something that's probably not technically a book. And so, writing really started with tablets. There's one. there's one there. So this is from the time of Hammurabi, roughly. And they're quite special things. They're pretty rare to own. And that one's been half translated. As it turns out, there's not many people that read cuneiform anymore. It's a language that's kind of died out. But this is the start of the written word, really. I mean, you can argue that you have like cave paintings and things like that and various symbols, but as a proper written script, as an alphabet of sorts, you have tablets here. And moving on from that, because that's how it was for a good 3,000 years without much of an evolution there, you started to move to scrolls. So the works of everyone, the ancients that people know, your Homer, Euripides, Aristophanes, all that lot, they were either through oral tradition, of course, like Homer, or in scroll format. And so with these, they were pretty fragile. We've handled a few scrolls in our time, and even now, even ones that aren't that old, have to be handled pretty carefully. They're quite fragile things. And correspondingly, pretty much none of them survive, other than the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the 40s, the 1940s, that is. And those are some people call it the most amazing archaeological find ever. But the copies we know today of, your Plato, Aristotle, etc., they're all copies of copies of copies where someone would read an earlier one, copy it out, and then this is a tradition which continued, and necessarily continued, all the way up until printing. But we'll get there. And so scrolls look a bit like that. That's a photo of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are all ancient Jewish texts, dating between the 3rd century and the 1st century. And yeah, they're absolutely amazing. Modern scroll, modern, this one's from the 18th century. There's one we've got at home. They survive, but not many of them, especially because this format really dies out by the 1st century AD, other than in Judaism and a few other areas. And it's really Christians that, in the very early period, mark the shift from the scroll format to books. Although it wasn't just the Christians, of course, lots of people were doing it, but very early on, it was Christians throughout the Roman Empire. So this is the earliest book. book where it looks like a book where you turn pages, that exists in private hands at least. There's some slightly older, but that's really the oldest one. And that sold, actually, this year. That one sold for £3 million. And it's not the complete book, it's a bit of it. And if it were complete, it would be worth a lot more than that. Not that that's a exactly cheap price. But that was quite a cool thing. It's in Greek, of course, being Christian. It's one of the books of the Old Testament, as I recall. It's not a New Testament thing, but even still. And so the strange thing is that there's almost nothing that survives between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the 1,000 years that come after it. You start to see a bit more preserved in that time. It's just these things were fragile, and really paper was invented in the 10th, 11th century, somewhere around there, and that was a lot more durable. This is an example of paper from that time period. This is from roughly the 10th century, and that's part of a larger codex, and those things are pretty rare and very expensive. But you start to go a little bit later, and you get all sorts of things that are preserved. This stuff is typically religious material in nature, or things relating to religious material, like Tacitus or Josephus, or these ancient historians who, mention Jesus or something like that. And so you go slightly later, a couple centuries later, you get loads of stuff. You just get this explosion of material. And there's, people talk about all sorts of different reasons, but one of them, I think, is paper and it being very durable. Rather than things like animal skin, it was also a lot cheaper to write on and to produce. Whereas with a Torah scroll, for example, that used 120 goats to make one, and it took a scribe a year to write one out. A trained scribe, at least a year. That would be a fast scribe, a full year. And so they were very expensive. And back then, it would only be a synagogue or something like that that would own it. So this is what that codex is from, at least what's left of it. And these things, generally, they're only preserved because they had a secondary use. Say they were used in a binding like this. This is a manuscript a bit later. That's from the 1400s. But this is generally how they end up being preserved. And you can see it's quite small. Books, when they were first printed, were pretty big. They didn't get small until the late 1400s, 1491. But when you start talking about the book, because they were such luxury items early on, the production of them themselves in the Jewish tradition became a sort of act of religious devotion itself. They became very artistic and beautiful books. Here's an example of a manuscript of Aristotle from the 13th century, and it's just beautiful. These borders will usually be the arms of someone or other in Italy, probably. Sometimes the Vatican. This one I don't think is identified, but this one's from the same time period as this, which is a copy of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, from his lifetime, roughly. And I think it's a nice parallel with Aristotle and Aquinas. And so you go a bit later and they get really very extravagant. There's the Book of Hours, which was quite small. Here's one here. And these were used largely for things like personal devotion, and they were illuminated in real gold and very rich, rare colours like blue from lapis lazuli and various things like that. Black in particular is very rare. They're almost never done with any black. If it is, it'll be like slight borders, because black ink didn't come by it very often. But Books of Hours in particular, of course, they were the Catholic in nature and would just be for personal prayers and things like this. And of course, we're talking about books quite generally, but the people that owned them, well, most people wouldn't own them, of course. It would be kings and institutions and royalty. These were unbelievably expensive. It'd be, Catherine de' Medici who would own something like this, not even your noblemen or something like that, they just wouldn't be owned. They'd be owned by institutions and things like that. And so that's the first 3,000 years, quite quickly. We don't really do that much. I mean, do some manuscripts, things like this, but generally, we'll talk about the printing press. And with the printing press, they really were that big. They were absolutely massive. And in order to actually use it, you get a single bit of paper, and you'd print a page at a time. And it would go underneath this, and you'd turn the big crank and you put the ink on the paper, and then you'd have to individually set the type for each one. Here's a very early book. That's the first edition of Dante's Divine Comedy, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. The first illustrated edition, the one published in Florence. I'll do a little case study on that in a minute because it's really very interesting. These are designs by Sandro Botticelli. And so they are incredible things. Of course, the first book printed, as you might expect, in Mainz, was the Gutenberg Bible. The first printed book using movable type. There was some kind of Eastern stuff a little prior, but not quite the same thing. Each one cost 30 florins, which was about 3 years' average salary for one book. So quite expensive. But comparatively, compared to a manuscript one, handwritten, cheap, half the price. And so it really did start to take off, especially as technology made it cheaper and faster to produce them, and that happened rapidly, as we'll see in a moment. There's no complete Gutenberg Bibles left in private hands. They're all in museums, and as you can imagine, are worth quite a lot of money. 4 leaves, a leaf being a double-sided page, so 8 pages. They weren't even consecutive, just sold for just under $1 million. So someone spent that for a few pages of it, so it's obviously very significant. And it's estimated that a complete copy would be worth quite a lot, 50 to 100 million. So one double-sided page, a leaf, recently sold, they tend to go for about 100 grand a pop. So for a page, that's it's quite a lot. Early stuff is, well, it's just so important. It's one of the most important inventions of all time, as we'll see. And so the early printing press, I think the vast majority of the actual book that was printed was the Bible. Of course, there was other stuff, but not really until the 1470s anyway. But just to track printing, it's easy to use the example of the Bible in this case. And so as you can see, in its first 2 decades of operation, it really printed hardly anything at all. Less than 10 editions total in 15 years. Really not very much at all. And then you just get this explosion in the later 1470s, after about 1475, especially in Rome and places like that, and later in France. And you can see this on a graph here, where you just get this later explosion of editions in Lyon. But early on here, anything prior to about 1475, there's just hardly any of them. There's so little printed. Any book prior to 1475 is inherently worth a lot of money, even if it's something a bit boring, of which there are things a bit boring that were printed back then. And no book is actually worth money just because it's old. We've sold books from the 1700s for £10 that, you can get. They're not, if it's a bit boring, then no one's really going to be that interested in it. The only books that are worth money purely because they're old are the ones printed within the first 50 years of the invention of the printing press. And it's just because nothing has ever compared to the quality of printing that came out of this early period. And so, if you can see by the cities, the blue is the first 10 years of production, and really it's in 2 cities only, and hardly any additions at all. But then later we get explosions into all different places. And I'll just skip that and go to this map where you can see where printing spread. So on the left here, in its first few years, you've got hardly any places at all. And then on the right, these printing presses were established on the European trade routes, as you'd expect. And so, like here we've got London over there. with William Caxton. Well, Westminster in 1476 and London properly, they were kind of considered separate back then, of 1480. So still quite late. No printing at all up until 1480. This book over here is 1481, so it's it's just slightly later. And I think from that you can really see how the Protestant Reformation and ideas were just being spread rapidly about this distribution network. And if you go after 1490, it's just lit up like a Christmas tree. There's so many. But throughout all of that time, books were hugely expensive prior to and after the printing press. But the big influence was that it completely opened the access to knowledge itself. And so people rightly call it one of the most important inventions of all time in that regard. And some people say we're going through that revolution right now as well in the digital world, but who knows. So these books were inaccessible entirely to all people well until the 1700s, 1800s, as the printing press got better and faster. So the early days of printing, they were such beautifully high quality. By the 1490s, it started to decline a little bit because they're trying to mass produce them. Mass produce, like 1,000 copies, not like mass production nowadays. But in the modern day, all of these early books are owned by museums and institutions that they hardly ever come to the market if they do. The earliest one you can buy is 1465, 1473. There's a bit of a range in the date, and that was printed by Adolf Rusch and Johannes Mentelin. Mentelin is the fellow that printed the first Bible in Germany in 1466, for example. And why does it say? Well, I've got a copy of that. So that's why it's obtainable. Outside of this copy, there's none earlier than a few years later in private hands anywhere. As few as 5 of kind of that edition or earlier available. Well, available, it's the only one on the market, but in private hands worldwide, it looks like that. I decided not to bring it because it's the kind of thing that's best not handled so much, because it's quite a special thing. Yulia says this looks like a fairy tale binding. It looks like something out of a Disney movie that you just open and it's a fairy tale or something like that. You can see you've got this inheritance of the manuscript tradition in these early ones as well, where these letters were done by hand throughout the whole thing. And especially in Bibles, when you get to somewhere like the Psalms, where you've got new chapters all the time, it really was quite a lot of work to do those, but they did that through the whole thing, and it's really quite a lot. Here's an example of a very nice illuminated initial in gold here. This is a later Bible. We sold this a little while ago. And here's the Psalms in this copy, and just beautifully done. And you can see whoever set the type initially put what are called guide letters for what's known as the rubricator, the person that painted these, to come in and put it over the top, just so they didn't do it incorrectly. They do it incorrectly all the time anyway, but they try to do it that way. So in terms of survival of these early books, I think the 1481 Dante is just a great example. It's why I brought it today. So this brings together a bunch of really important early names in especially Renaissance humanism. So Dante, of course, Sandro Botticelli, who did the illustrations. He was interrupted to go and paint the Sistine Chapel while doing the engravings for this edition. Couldn't quite finish them. Baccio Baldini is the woodcut engraver who copied the designs after Botticelli. And then you've got Ficino and Cristoforo Landino, these very important Renaissance humanist scholars who, Landino provided the commentary to the edition. And so if you can see here, there's actually this smaller type, it's a bit blurry, is the text of Dante itself in Canto 30 of Purgatory, and the text around it in a slightly larger type is the commentary. And so the actual, and this was very common for books of this period, and so it's quite imbalanced. You get a lot of commentary for quite a little amount of text. And in all editions of this that survive, there's massive spaces left, which is a bit weird. And that's because there were supposed to be illustrations put in there, but Sandro Botticelli only completed about 19 of the original 100 that were conceived, and only in Dante's Inferno, so the others were just left blank, and they just printed it anyway, because it was so expensive to do this. Here's two very interesting copies. That's the copy in the National Library of France, and that's the one that was presented to Lorenzo de' Medici, and it's just beautifully coloured by hand. Absolutely gorgeous copy. That's easily worth 500,000, £1 million, something like that. Very expensive. Here's a less magnificent copy in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and I find this one just funny. I've got it turned to the same page in my copy, where you can just tell they set these illustrations by hand. Sometimes they didn't go to plan. This one's upside down and wonky. So, yeah, it's a funny little quirk. And in this edition, there's bits of the text that weren't printed properly, and so in many copies, you can see it's been done by hand in the space where it is. That's one of them. And so you can tell into how Dante was read during the 15th century, because it would have been compared to earlier manuscripts. Very unlikely earlier editions because of the political history of this book. So books, especially in this time period, began to really be used for political purposes. And this is one of the first for that, because Dante before, the first edition was 1472, there's a few editions in the interim, but none of them were printed in Florence, where Dante lived and wrote the Divine Comedy. And so Lorenzo de' Medici wanted to reclaim Dante for Florence. He wanted to reclaim the power of the Florentine dialect of Italian, and so he commissioned this absolutely, well, intended to be magnificent edition, but it didn't quite go to plan. So a copy census was performed by the University of Oxford. There's like a 2 or 3 hour lecture about this online. It's really interesting. And of the 1,125 copies originally printed, a huge print run for this period. I think the largest print run of any book this early. About 168, 169 copies survive. 166 are in museums. So this is one of only 2 or 3 copies that are in private hands. So it's a very cool book. So it's the kind of thing that's usually, behind glass or in a little storeroom somewhere. The John Rylands Institute at the University of Manchester has 5 copies. They've got a good collection. But they describe this, the Rylands Institute, as the most ambitious project undertaken by the printing press during its entire first century of operation. You have 2 different fonts at work on the same page. You have spaces being left both for letters to be illuminated and coloured in, even though that didn't really happen in most copies. You have loads of spaces in all 100 cantos of Dante's Commedia, and this was just an absolute feat of the kind of technical engineering of the printing press just within a couple decades of its inception. So the immense difficulty of printing something like that is just shown by just how flawed every copy is, and every copy is unique in different ways, which is just a testament to how they were made by hand. It's so interesting. Yeah, and that's just talking about the illustrations. So most copies have none. Some have as many as 2 or perhaps 3. The engraving for Canto 2 and 3 of the Inferno is also copied. But the ones with the full suite, they were later glued in. And only a few of those are known to exist because he went to the Sistine Chapel. So it was a massive political statement, this book, and this is a tone that was set for the future printing of a lot of books, how they would be used for religious and political motivations, especially when we get after about 1525 and we talk about the Protestant Reformation. And so the whole point was regional superiority for Florence. It really didn't work, but this was the point. It was the use of a book itself and the edition to reclaim Dante and the beautiful language of the Divine Comedy for themselves. That's a quote from UCL, but I've pretty much said what they talk about there. It says at the end, UCL's copy has 2 of the plates, the first being cut off. That's another little eccentricity of the edition. The first page, the illustration was too big for the paper, so the first page was a bit longer, and so almost all the copies, someone's cut that off because it was really annoying. So in most copies, that's been trimmed off. It's the same in this copy, actually, but this one has been replaced by a later one of the same illustration. So this has the full suite of illustrations, but the others are pasted in later. That's the print of one of the originals. Very cool. If that was just the print of Sandro Botticelli from 1481, it would be important. But it being in this edition of Dante, it's just incredible. Here's a bit from the New York Times in 1912, where a copy of that sold for $9,000 in 1912. So that was a lot of money in 1912, 3 times the price of a house, same as the price of a house in New York on average, and they're quite a lot of money now. So yeah, they are quite expensive. That was a beautiful copy. That ended up in, can't remember, maybe the Huntington Library, somewhere like that, one of the American institutions. Right, anyway, so that's a very interesting book. Here's it here. Let me just pop it out there. There you go. The binding is obviously later. It's vellum, pigskin, from 19th century, quite a lot later. If we see the first page of this, the opening initial has been coloured in red, contemporary to printing in the 1480s, in a very typical Florentine style. And then this bottom thing has clearly been cut off and pasted in afterwards. So it's a very interesting book for that reason. Right. So, the Protestant Reformation. So, I think this was brought about by books kind of like this. This is an edition of Mamitrectus Super Bibliam, which was one of the most popular printed editions of anything other than the Bible itself in the late medieval period. And this was just a commentary on the Bible. The literal meaning is the milker of the Bible. Trying to get the meaning of it's a bit weird, but, whatever. So, you had these early books that are really being spread about, especially to universities and very well-educated people. And so by the early 1500s, books were widely spread and became widely accessible. And so scholars had a wide range of ideas, and they didn't have to consult incredibly expensive, fragile and rare early manuscript copies of these various books. Things like, Plato and Virgil and whatnot, and kind of bring it all together. And so this is right around the start of the early modern period. That's an edition of Erasmus's New Testament, which later formed the basis for the King James Bible and the Geneva. That's a copy we sold of it ages ago now. And so this rise of humanism was marked mostly just by incredible skepticism of traditional authority, especially, of course, the Catholic Church. And people like Martin Luther, of course, and, Zwingli's not mentioned there, but Zwingli as well, Erasmus, Reuchlin, Melanchthon, all those people of the early 16th century, they were identifying these corruptions and abuses, things like plenary indulgences and all of that kind of thing. And they eventually decided to split off from the Catholic Church. Well, Luther did that, even if it wasn't his original intention. And so the printing press itself is the thing that really did that, and that's the thing that marked the biggest transition in books themselves, to bring it back there. So the printing press was hugely powerful and helped the rapid spread of Reformation ideas. So this book in particular here, this one is an edition, a 16th century edition of John Calvin's Institutes, Institutio of the Christian Religion, and it's bound in a Catholic manuscript from the 15th century. It's just this great historical juxtaposition. It's like, we don't need that anymore. We're reformed now. So it's even just the production of books themselves. It was just a comment on, nah, we're new now. We're different. And so the printing press quickly became very efficient, and books were put in a lot other languages than just Latin. Most of them were Latin. You got, English eventually, but that took quite a long time. We'll get on to what was going on in England in a minute, but with books like this, they were all this big. This was the standard size for a book. None were printed in any other size, really, other than bigger ones, until 1491. So the early books, they were all folio. That's the name for a book that size. Ones which were smaller started to happen a bit later on. So for the first 30 or 40 years, they were huge, very expensive, and the only way they made them shorter was they just folded paper in half and cut it instead. So they printed it the same way. They just folded the paper instead. Here's an example of a small Bible, octavo size, kind of your normal book size, a bit quite similar to this, but a bit thicker. This is a first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, one of the earliest feminist works. So that's a very nice, important book. And so that smaller format also allowed for them to be spread a bit more. And that became a lot more common after the 1490s. The printer of that was Johannes Froben in Basel in Switzerland, but it spread very quickly throughout everywhere, and it became a far more common size for books to be, it had to be like this. It didn't have to be stood on a lectern, and, because they're very heavy. That one's only quite light because of the binding. That Bible I mentioned the other day is bound in, the other minute, is bound in wood, wooden boards. And the wood's very thick, and it was made to protect the book because they were very expensive and heavy. And it's a really heavy book. You wouldn't want to carry it around. But these you could carry around and read. So England, we'll come here. So printing came to England in 1476, and the first book here was the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer. Copies of that, very expensive, of course. 10 million, something like that. And the first English Bible was a lot later, in 1525, and of course that was a massive controversial move. William Tyndale was burnt alive for doing so, for daring to translate the Bible into English. If he'd lived about 3 years later, Henry VIII would have been fine, because he split off in about 1539 to 41, and he'd have been fine, but he was executed for daring to do so. And the Tyndale Bible, it's small, and it was small on purpose because it's made to be smuggled in and to be hidden, to spread what the Bible actually said in English, because people couldn't really read at the time, not Latin. It was a very formal language, and so people could kind of read and understand this, even if I can't today, because the script's pretty difficult to read. Would you believe that's in English? I mean, the early English is hard to read, especially what's called black letter, the Gothic script. And so the 1539 Great Bible, so named because of its size, and Henry VIII wanted to emphasize its great, it was the first to be authorized for actual use in England, and represents really the start of Protestantism in England, where Henry VIII founds the Church of England and all of that. And in 1560, we get the Geneva Bible, which is very important, and people actually liked that version. Your average person didn't really like the English versions early on, but in 1560, this one was very popular. But it had some marginal notes which criticised things like monarchy. And so when King James came along, he didn't really like that very much. And so he banned that. A bit later, in 1616, that was banned. But the King James Bible was printed in 1611. And the first edition is beautiful, beautiful title page, amazing engraving. And really, it's after this that books and their engraving and language in English is really all modelled after this book, the King James Version, even if it isn't that different from the earlier editions. And so in England, any book, anything prior to 1550 is incredibly rare and very expensive. The oldest book in English, or printed in England, I've ever seen was 1522. And such things are just so rare. Caxton, I've seen Caxton, but I meant like actually handled and things like that. I've seen Caxton behind glass. But English books, in the 17th century, they really take off, and they take off with things like this, which is the first edition of Boccaccio's Decameron in English, with a, you can see, kind of inspired title page, quite similar in style to the King James. And this comes 9 years later in 1620, and it's just Italian literature's being brought in, various other things. This is an early edition of Shakespeare. We haven't had one of the folios yet, but we've had the next best thing. We've had the first edition of Shakespeare after the folios. One day. And then on the right, that's a handwritten manuscript we've had, which directly relates to Shakespeare, which was really cool. And that was from 1599. It was related to a bunch of people at the time: Beaumont, Fletcher, Ben Jonson, all that lot. And so we get to English books, and you start to actually get things that are printed that you might want to read. Things like a history of Henry VIII. That was very controversial. That's from 1649. History of Elizabeth. These were all copies that we had. And very importantly over here, the history of the Council of Trent. And you'd also get various histories of ecumenical councils for Protestant things. And you'd have the history of the Council of Florence in, 1439, and Chalcedon. And people would sit at the pub and argue about Christology and things like this. Not quite the same anymore. And you keep on going, and you get things like maps and beautiful books relating to various counties and things that were actually useful. People would read them for their actual use, like this, a topographical survey of the county of Kent. Imagine if you lived in Kent in the 1650s or 60s, that would be pretty useful. And these amazing map designers started to pop up in England. Prior to that, they were largely Dutch, and those early maps are gorgeous. Had one of those early editions of Ptolemy before, just beautiful world maps. They're not very correct, but they're beautiful. Maps didn't really start to get broadly correct until not far after this time. They were a lot more accurate than you'd think. But even up until the late 1700s, they had California as an island, famously, off the coast of America. So always quite wrong. But you can see you've got this influence of the title page there. And, it'd just be the laws of ecclesiastical polity, and that was a very popular book. There's about 100 editions of that printed. Here's a very special binding, and here's where books start to become an art form again in England. Here's a book binding that we sold a little while ago, and it's just beautiful. This is after the restoration of the monarchy. So after 1660, they kick Cromwell out, and they bring back literature and arts and all this kind of stuff, and they have these just stunningly beautiful things. This is a bit of an opinion here, the best book bindings ever done, and it is an absolute art form still practiced to this day, was this period, was between 1660 and 1690, of which this is one of those. They weren't all like this, of course. This was done by the bookbinder to the king, so he was pretty good, Samuel Merne. And this design is called the cottage roof design. Apparently it looked like a cottage roof. I'm not sure I really see it, but that's what it's called. And you have these just beautiful kind of flowers and ornamental designs, and it's just stunning. And it's made in, sometimes they'd use silver, sometimes gold. Here you've got the original owner's initials engraved on the front. This one in particular was owned by the family of slave traders in the time period, and those are the kinds of people that would have the money to afford it, and thus by descent in the Marryat family. Some of you might have heard of Charles Marryat. He wrote Mr. Midshipman Easy and things like that, and he was a sailor and things like that. That was his family Bible, so we sold that a little while ago. But this return of Charles II was very important because you kick out Cromwell and these kind of quite boring books that are, no illustrations, just text, and they're quite hard to read. They're pretty heavy going of that period. All the way from the English Civil War forward, there's a lot of pamphlets, and they're all very political, and they're very interesting historically, but they're a bit dry. A bit dry to read. And so with this, you get this renewed interest. This is when Paradise Lost is written and printed in 1667. It was first performed or first read in Ludlow Castle, which is quite interesting. Milton was kind of associated with Ludlow. He did a few of his things around here. Paradise Lost, it had 5 editions within about 4 months. So they were really pumping that out. And it's of course, up to then, it wasn't thought that the English language could really be beautiful. But I think Milton really changed that because it's such an amazing thing. And then, of course, we zip through a little bit and we get to the Enlightenment period, where you get a much more clear promotion of science and reason. You get printings of people like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton a lot more often. And of course, you get things like the Scottish philosophers, you get David Hume and people like that who really explode this view of kind of rationalism and empiricism especially, and then later on various other philosophies. And of course, this had a massive impact on society itself and whatnot, with this advocation of reason and science. And science really grew here. I mean, Francis Bacon is probably about where modern science starts, and this is where it really explodes. And I don't think that explosion's really stopped. But these presses were really efficient by this time, and this is the point where middle-class readership, middle class, could afford and read them. And you also had the growth of public libraries and book clubs, so you didn't actually have to own a book. And this is about the time that the bookcase was invented. I didn't know that till recently. It was Samuel Pepys of diary fame, Great Fire of London. He invented the bookcase, the one that moves. That wasn't just built into your stately home. It was one that you could actually move as a bookcase. Even if they were quite heavy, they were movable. It wasn't just built into a room. And Samuel Pepys is the fella that did that. And so obviously there was demand for such a thing, where people would have little bookcases and they'd take them on their horse and carriage, and so they'd move their books around with them. We'll just talk about this briefly, because I think it's at this period you really start to get massive political movements that start arguably about this time, and they're laying the foundation, and they later explode in interest a bit later on. So I mean, this is a bit more of a controversial view, but I think it's things like this, which is a magazine from 1776, important for American people, not so much here. And this is the Ladies' Magazine, or entertaining companion for the fair sex, appropriately solely to their use and amusement. And it's surprisingly feminist in nature. You've got poetry, you've got printed music, which appears in here, and piano, and it's talking about philosophy and all sorts of things that you wouldn't typically expect of the period. And a bit later, you get one of the, probably the most important early feminist work, Mary Wollstonecraft and things like that. And then you can see the precursor to other things in this period as well, but I think feminism in particular is the big one. But the Industrial Revolution is the thing that starts to actually properly democratize access to things. You have steam-powered printing presses that they went, and mass production, and newspaper circulation, and magazines. Here's an example of a magazine. It's a bit different to what you'd typically expect a magazine would look like. It was full with printings of people's handwriting and illustrations. This is a copy of the Strand magazine, quite an early one. This is actually has the first edition of Sherlock Holmes in it. They were often put in magazine form. Likewise, Charles Dickens was released in parts like this. This is the first edition, one of the parts. They're released in monthly parts, and you'd subscribe, and it's a bit like a TV show nowadays. You'd get a part a month, and you had to keep the subscription the whole time, and eventually you'd know what happened. And the last part was often a double, and it'd be a big cliffhanger, and they'd wait 2 months or something like that. And so Dickens was the one that really popularised that. that mode. Not all of his books were like that. A Christmas Carol, for example, was released 6 days before Christmas, and things like that. But this one, this is Our Mutual Friend, but most of his books were released like that, and he wrote a lot of books. But you'd find books like this as well. Mark Twain, this is the first edition of Huckleberry Finn. It's an iconic book, just the cover. It's very controversial for kind of racist reasons, and it was later changed. But still, books back then, they were just beautiful books, with like illustrations and everywhere, and just built into the text. And you can just see that the printing at this time is just very sophisticated. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You could read a book for fun, and not just necessarily to learn something or for it to be educational or something like that. They were just books for fun that were coming out. Especially Dickens, even if his books were sometimes a bit bleak. And cloth bindings came out as well. So up until this period, every book was in leather. Leather was expensive. If anyone's ever seen a book bound or something like that, it takes ages. It's delicate work. And it's just not something that you want to do for a print run of 1 million books or something like that. With cloth bindings, you could just do them so quickly. And they were pretty good. They stood the test of time. This is from the 1800s, and it's the original cloth and looks pretty good. We've got a first edition of Alice in Wonderland at home that looks the part, and it's just a fine copy, just absolutely kind of untouched from 1866. And you couldn't really get a book like that a bit earlier, because even though the paper quality isn't very good, and you get things like foxing and mould and things like that all the time, the paper quality isn't good. No book, I don't think, has ever been printed as high quality as in the first days of the printing press. Some may claim that title, like William Morris at the Kelmscott Press, especially his edition of Chaucer, which is beautiful. But we go forward, and we know the story here. It's just 20th century, you get the paperbacks, things like that, especially by Penguin. And interestingly, in terms of printing, the big rise of comic books and graphic novels and things like that, especially things printed in colour. So A Christmas Carol, for example, had 4 illustrations in colour, but every single one had to be coloured by hand, and that was very expensive because colour printing didn't exist yet in 1843. But not long later, you got things like chromolithography and things like that. But books in colour were very desirable. A lot of the hand-coloured books back then were beautiful views of cities and especially birds. You got John Gould and people like that with beautiful, beautiful books with illustrations of birds. A set of John Gould's illustrated books of birds recently sold for £2 million, so they're quite expensive too. But they're more works of art than books necessarily. And to close, we have today things like laser and inkjet printing and just mass production. But interestingly enough, it's the only time between kind of the invention of the printing press and now where printing is, like physical printing, is starting to fall again. And you get things like digital books. The Kindle, and you can self-publish something. And though it's probably a good thing, as you move into now, you've got things like artificially written things, AI and all that kind of thing. But simultaneously, you do have this wonderful revival of just artisan printing alongside mass production. That's just, people are they look at books like this from a long time ago just with kind of awe and like, we should go back to when things were made properly. Here's an example of just a modern book. This is an edition of Einstein's Relativity. Not exactly light reading, but it's full of maths and stuff. And putting maths in a typeset is pretty difficult because you've got all sorts of scripts there. I mean, Greek especially. But this is from the 1990s, so it's pretty modern. And a book like this, even though it's very nice and it's real leather and gold and whatnot, it's less than £100, even for a very nice copy. And you get books like this, like Lord of the Rings, which has been printed a lot. That's the first edition of The Return of the King. I've had a nice set of the others before. And that's the first edition of The House at Pooh Corner, one of the Winnie the Pooh books. That's one of our favourites. And we've had a lot of those. The Winnie the Pooh ones, they sell too fast to come along to something like this. We get one and they just go straight away. The same with a lot of the children's literature. Children's literature, especially like the Andrew Lang fairy books and Alice in Wonderland and things like that, they just go. It's one of the biggest collecting categories. Anyway, so there we are. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Harry. Anyway, Harry's open to questions now. Has anybody got a question for Harry? There's one at that, I'm sorry. Oh, Jonathan.
Can you say a bit more about the sort of 20th century artisan production, where there's quite a lot of use of old techniques?
Yeah, so especially with how they print things, they don't quite do it the exact same with the printing press, but they will get type and put ink on it and paste it onto the paper and things like that and bind it all together very nicely and sew the pages in rather than glue them and things like that as they're usually done. They'll be properly sewn in and it's delicate work. I can't do it, but but I know a lot of people can. I've tried to do it, but it's very difficult. You've got to have very steady hands. It's like surgery. But bookbinding especially, of fine modern stuff, they have like competitions and all sorts. There's a lot of good fine modern presses that are about. There's mostly in England and Wales. They're the ones that kind of spearhead the movement, quite interestingly. England has really kind of led the charge on that for a long time, but it's of course spreading all over the place. But artisan printing, there's a big collector base for it. Modern books from things like the Golden Cockerel press and things like that, they are sometimes worth a lot of money. They typically do them in like small edition runs. They'll print a copy of Homer's Iliad, and they'll make 100 copies of it, and they'll commission a modern illustrator to illustrate it, and they'll have the illustrator sign every copy and hand number it and that kind of thing, and it's a nice kind of gift thing, but they are typically quite expensive. As you can imagine, it's a lot of work to go into it to only make 100 copies to make your money back. You've got to price them quite high. But they are very nice. I'm not one particularly for modern books so much. I like the old stuff, but I can appreciate them. My favourite is incunables, the 1400s, and manuscripts. They're fun.
I think Jane.
Hello. You mentioned early public libraries. I assume they weren't lending libraries.
No, they would be chained libraries generally, like the one at Hereford Cathedral. Books would be very expensive. They'd attach chains to them, to the bookcases, so no one would run off with it. But even still, people would often kind of tear a page out and take it home, and so.
I was wondering who financed the earliest sort of public libraries, like the Linen Library in Belfast is one that I remember.
Yeah, so it was typically one of two things. It was either the church or it was a university or something like that. The early ones were typically the church, and they'd happen within that setting. But universities in particular as well, especially in Germany. There weren't that many public libraries in England, but there were loads in Germany. There's some beautiful chain libraries.
When you say public, do you mean that anybody could go? Surely not.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, but a lot of people just didn't really have much interest in going because they couldn't read. Yeah, reading wasn't widespread until, well, depends where, but 1800s? Well, maybe now. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know any name, but anyway, far away.
I'm intrigued. You're talking about the Gutenberg Bible. Preparing typeface for that, was that the job of a lot of people, or was it one person persevering for hours and hours. And were they cut in hardwood or?
Yeah, usually wood or metal. A lot of the time metal, but woodcuts too. The illustrations were pretty much always in wood because steel or things like that were not steel at that point, but it would corrode the paper and things like that. But with the Gutenberg press in particular, it would be a very small number of people. Gutenberg worked with two other people. Fust and Schoeffer were their names. And Fust later sued him because they had a bit of a battle about that. And it was quite a famous thing. It went on until between 1455 all the way up to 62. So it was quite a drawn-out thing. But yeah, they were typically manned by a very small amount of people. It kind of had to be because it would take a long time to actually print a book, especially early on. It'd take more than a year to print an edition generally. And they'd have to hand set every letter of the type. Every letter, say, of an entire Bible, that's a lot of letters. I know in the Torah in particular, there's 304,000 letters. And that's just 5 books, and they had the Catholic Bible, so that was 73 books. And some of them are a lot bigger than the ones like Genesis, like Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the biggest book in the King James anyway. I'm not sure about the early ones, but it's pretty big. So it would take a long time just to set the type. But I think they got pretty quick at it. And they didn't make many mistakes. They were pretty accurate. And of course they had to do it backwards. So they were pretty good at it. Yeah, it was very impressive.
Any other questions? Brian, did I see your hand raised?
That's all right.
Oh, okay, right, sorry. Pauline.
Did they, with early printers, have advanced, people request copy in advance, and did they judge how big printer on how many people had said, I will put my money down and buy it?
Yeah, a lot of the time they were sponsored by somebody, some very rich person, or institution to print an edition of something. Like, take the first edition of Virgil, which was in 1469, quite early. Only 8 copies of it are left, and none of them are in private hands. That was commissioned by a very rich person who particularly liked Virgil, who liked reading Virgil. And so a lot of the time, with something like the Bible, they could pretty readily just get away with printing it because it would just sell. But other books, like something, say, a bit more dry, something like canon law or, something like that, ecclesiastical law, quite a niche subject, that would typically be commissioned. They wouldn't print very many of them. The same with something like Plato. Plato didn't come until way later. I find it surprising sometimes with when they were translated. Dante wasn't translated into English until the 19th century. I found that crazy, until the 1800s. So if you wanted to read Dante and you were in the 1700s, you were out of luck. You had to learn Italian or Latin. Generally Italian. This one's in Italian. Most of them were.
Joe?
I was wondering about the growing popularity of the novel in the 18th century through to Jane Austen in the early 19th century. Things like Tristram Shandy and Gothic novels. How would those have been circulated and read in order to gain that popularity?
Yeah, so the example you gave, Tristram Shandy in particular, and things like Clarissa, Samuel Richardson, those are very big books, very long books, and so they would be printed in multiple volumes. Clarissa, in particular, was 1780-something, I think, and that was 9 volumes for one book, pretty big, and so correspondingly quite expensive. You'd have to bind 9 books, 9 volumes to do it. And Tristram Shandy, I think, was 6 volumes. Tristram Shandy's an interesting one because the Lawrence Stern signed every edition of the first edition in 3 places to avoid piracy. People would pirate books back then. That started way early on with things like the Aldine Press with Aldus Manutius in the very early 1500s. You had people copying their editions and claiming it for their own and then selling it on, because sometimes it'd be like designer brands, and it'd be a certain printer and it'd be like, that one's worth more money because it's got this prestige, and they're trying to copy things. But with literature, they were usually multiple volumes. I think all of Jane Austen's works were multiple volumes. We've only had a couple of the first editions of Austen. They're pretty rare. And she wasn't read that much in her lifetime. Most of them, like Northangerabian Persuasion, was published posthumously, I think. With that, these were books that people could just afford. And what you'd often find is in the back of books, you'd have an advertisement list. The publisher would put, oh, we're going to release this book as well. And they did that way into the 1700s. It became a lot more popular in the 1800s. You read a magazine, and they're full of them, one like this. And there'd be more general things like building insurance and things like that. But back then, it was only things that the printer was going to publish. And so it's usually missing in books because people would just tear it out and go to the printer because they wouldn't remember. With that, you'd have a big list, and it'd say, also by this author. And on title pages, like with Jane Austen, you'd say, Jane Austen wasn't on the title page for some of the first editions. It'd be Pride and Prejudice by the author of Sense and Sensibility, or something like that. And so they'd be linked to other works and things like that. It became very hard, I think, to become very popular. Like, I think it's quite miraculous someone like Mary Shelley became very popular printing just really Frankenstein. And that is worth an absolute fortune, that book. At least $1 million, I think, the first edition. It's very expensive. I haven't had one. I'd quite like one. But it was generally word of mouth. Someone would read this. Of course, when the writer wrote their book, it'd be by hand, of course, and they'd take their manuscript to someone and say, could you read this, please? And the printer would be like, don't want it. It's not very good. And like back then, you might have to go to multiple printers and you'd get rejected a few times, and eventually someone would take you on. If you're a female writer, in particular, in the 1700s or 1800s, you're probably more likely to get rejected. It's why a lot of them use pseudonyms, people like George Eliot. So, yeah, and the Brontes. Those Bronte books are lovely. Well, some of them are a bit miserable, but
Terry, did you have a question?
Well, one of the things about that really interests me about this is the way it conveys information and the way people retrieve information and the changes in the way that happens. There's quite some scholarly work on early manuscripts which shows the layout and the illustrations were as important as the text, particularly in guiding. And I just wondered what you felt was the precursor to the first printed books in terms of guiding that process in the way that it did. So it is noticeable from the illustrations you showed that those early ones are quite different in their layout to the later ones.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think this is a very good example of that. And it was often in rubrication. They would colour letters of paragraphs, or they would put in here, you can actually, well, you can't really see it very well because it's quite old, I mean, they would have different bits in different colours. So here, this bit's written in red instead of black, and it would highlight this bit as particularly significant or something like that. This is a great example of this because this isn't made for popular use. This is made especially for use in a university, probably Oxford, maybe Paris. And so it's very dense, and it's very neat columns. It's handwritten, of course, but very, very neat columns. They would have rubrication, which is where you colour a capital letter and it'd be really big. And sometimes there'd be what's called historiated, which is where they do a little picture on the inside. Sometimes the person got bored after doing a whole book and they'd put in like a little picture of a dog or something. And they're quite amusing. Sometimes you get hybrid creatures, which are really interesting, like monsters and things like that in like the margins, because the person that was painting it got bored. With illustrations in particular, early on, illustrations would typically just be at the start of a chapter. So, like for example, with the Dante, it'd be the start of each canto, and you'd have Dante and Virgil meeting Statius, and looking at whichever circle of hell or something like that, and the illustration would guide that readership. But with the early stuff, with the manuscripts, it would always be rubrication. Later on, they just got carried away and just rubricated everything. But early on, they would do each.
I think the illustration sometimes will allow for a narrative to be concluded from the picture rather than necessarily from the text, i.e. for an unreading, so that it would still be meaningful to somebody who couldn't read.
Yeah.
And does your books with the blanks in show that when that was beginning to go out of fashion, people were beginning to read more?
Do you mean the Dante with the blank spaces? They were intended to have pictures there. They just didn't do them. But where you would have spaces and things like that, and where you'd put illustrations in, it's really, you can't really give a universal answer because it's going to depend on the genre of whatever you're reading. So you're not really going to have illustrations in an edition of Plato, for example, but you will in Dante, or something more literary, or even historical, maybe. Later on, you would get illustrations in something like Plato, sure, but they don't really say much of a narrative. And like this with Aquinas, no one's going to really illustrate the Summa Theologica or his commentary on Job or something like that. But people loved illustrating, and it's of course the movement from, well, it's an artistic thing, that art and books kind of went hand in hand that whole time, and still do, really.
I find it really interesting that it's the same in ancient manuscripts and also in other artistic and craft forms, but the craftsmen got carried away and did little illustrations that were nothing to do with the text or whatever. It's like in stained glass in churches, you see that, don't you? And glass, like there's the monkey's funeral in York and things like that. And then in the wood carvings and the stone carvings, same thing.
Yeah. You get it the whole way, even in like Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's maybe it's just some kind of part of being human that you just want to kind of doodle something in the margin or something. I don't know, because they definitely did it back then. I'm not sure you get it in cuneiform tablets, to be fair. I'm not sure. I haven't seen it. Yeah, you do get maps in cuneiform, but they're not exactly geographically accurate. They're usually kind of Jerusalem is the center of the world, and things like that. They're usually, a map would be not intended to be geographically accurate. Rather, it's like a kind of story, like John Bunyan in The Pilgrim's Progress or something like that, or Tolkien even. Although his maps are quite nice. You should see the map at the back of that. It's lovely. Like a lot of books were published with maps. Tolkien was. Big fold-out map, huge thing. I think some of my favourite is in Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. You just get these massive maps. So in some books you can get fold-out maps that are like that big, huge, and most people nick them and frame them and sell them for a fortune. There's an edition of Ptolemy. It was the edition that was burnt with Servetus in 1541. By John Calvin. They burnt Servetus at the stake and burnt a bunch of copies of Ptolemy with him, Ptolemy's Geographica, and it had beautiful maps. 1541, really early maps, had a bunch of them, and each map in that book is worth at least £20,000, right? And they had a bunch of them in there, so it's a very expensive book. However, pretty much all of the books have no maps in them because the book itself isn't worth as much as the sum total of all the maps separately. It's a bit like books of hours, like this. Most commonly, you'll find one page, one leaf, that someone's pulled out and sold separately, because you could sell one page from a book like this for a few £100, and the book itself is worth nowhere near the amount, especially if there's like 300 leaves in there or something. It might be worth a fortune. It's unfortunate. It's an absolute crime in the book world. People do it, like Gutenberg Bibles. The reason there's separate leaves is because not many people have 50 million quid to spend on a book, but many more, not that many more, many more can spend 100,000 on a page from the book. So it's an unfortunate thing that happens. I confess I have never done it. Won't do it. Like with this, a codex, you would never sell one of the fragments separately, even if it's easy. You always keep it together. You want to kind of retain the historical value, of course, you know?
Oh, OK. I think, if you wouldn't mind, I think we've given Harry quite a good grilling in terms of questions. So I think you'll all agree that's been absolutely fascinating. I know a number of you were looking at the books beforehand, and I'm presuming that Harry and Julia would be quite happy to talk to anybody who wants to just have a look at those books. But been absolutely fantastic talk, Harry. Thank you very much indeed. And could I ask people to show their appreciation for Harry?